Cool. Well, okay. So, hi everyone. Let's get our startup rolling. Stand up rolling. Is anyone want to volunteer to give the first update?
You got it.
Is that you volunteering?
Oh, not really, but I mean, I can go if you like.
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay, sure. Not too much of an update. Of course, the Casper video was released, and also the meetup. A lot has happened in 2 weeks. The meetup video as well, and still struggling to still wanting to have a concise definition of any kind of thing that approaches, economic finality. And then there's it's like, oh man, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I know what to do. I mean, people have been actually, I kind of like, people, people even have been asking me about your definition of economic finality after watching the video, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
I can tell you kind of my take, but maybe finish your update.
Okay, sure. I mean, I don't know. I have my, okay, I'm just gonna leave economic finality on the table so I can move on mentally. But and then outside of that, really the main updates are really starting, basically kind of improving the tests hugely on the validator. So now everything's like clean, and I'm very fine with all the validator code. And now it's really just like taking a look at the incentives. Oh, there's also a document which outlines kind of things that need to be worked on, which I came up with, and that was super helpful. And already it's out of date because I've made some progress. But yeah, so I would say that's like the main thing, like basically implementation pushing forward, and hopefully can talk about it more and when everyone's together in a couple days.
Cool. Yeah. So if no one minds, like I wouldn't. I think talking about economic finality is like I mean, we should do that now. Since we brought it up. So here's kind of my take, right? When we initially came up with this concept, what we were thinking about is basically after it costs a certain amount to lead to a reversion of a particular state of the protocol, particular block, then clients would subjectively make a decision about to never revert, right? And so kind of there was economic finality first, and then subjective finality as a response. And now kind of what's happened in protocol is that like somehow when we move to this more like BFT kind of approach rather than betting on the state of the consensus, we have like the line kind of blurred a bit in the sense that like there's finality in the protocol, which is like kind of gives you subjective finality and also economic finality kind of in the same blow. Basically, it says, look, once you can tolerate X Byzantine faults, that means that you can tolerate like that much worth of security deposits being burned, and also that you can make this like finality decision. And so it's kind of been like slightly blurred a bit in the at least if you look at the protocol, like once you get like 2/3 commits for the finality gadget, like there's both economic finality and like subjective finality. And the only case where in our current protocol where we kind of have subjective finality without economic finality is in the case where there's too many validators offline to make economic finality happen at all. So imagine if like all a vast majority of the validators go offline, then somehow eventually we're going to have to do, or we may do, subjective finality without economic finality. So that's kind of my take, and because of this like evolution, like somehow I mostly just talk about finality and the cost of causing safety failure, which is to say the cost of causing so many failures that if I finalize something and you finalize something, then we've made different decisions. And so somehow the term economic finality is mostly fallen out of my vocabulary, but I still find it, somewhat of a useful. It's still interesting. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I guess like the challenge basically is that you need some other notion of finality, because the notion of strictly economic finality could potentially be compromised if someone's like actually willing to pay the economic cost to do it.
Yeah. So like, you mean subjective finality?
Yeah. Well, no. So the idea is that like two conflicting states can both be economically finalized if a guy is willing to pay the money, the penalties for equivocation.
Of course, yeah, but in terms of the like a client side decision to never revert,
right? Yeah,
that can only happen on one of them.
Right. And although it is totally possible that like half the network makes a client side decision to never revert in favor of one side, and the other half goes in favor of the other side.
Exactly, and when I say consensus failure, that's exactly what I'm referring to.
Okay.
Because like, these sides will never come to consensus unless one of them does like a hard fork or a UASF.
Yeah.
Okay, Carl, is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that it's important to like, for me, it's a useful thing to think about, and I would say that the thing that, for at least when I'm talking about it and thinking about it recently, it's really just like you have in protocol costs associated with breaking finality or safety, and that's at least that's the big distinction between the kind of like proof of work and
well, but in proof of work, there's no finality that to be broken.
That's true. But yeah, there's like an implied kind of.
Well, people assume that 6 blocks and we're good.
Exactly.
But the protocol, absolutely doesn't say that.
Yeah. Cool.
I guess I feel like I'm going to give my update because I feel like Vitalik has a longer update to give, given these. So my update's pretty short because this last week I spent traveling. I mean, the week before also I was basically just like going. The week before I didn't make it to the stand up, I think. And the week the week up to last week's stand up, I was at the MIT ACM on computation and economics, and it was super interesting to see the stuff that people were working on. And then there's basically a few clusters of stuff that they're working on. Kind of there's like matching and market design. There's for markets with money, and also for certain problems where there's no money, like matching, say, like organs from donors to hospitals, in exchange for other organs. So it's kind of not like a matching problem where there isn't money on the other side, but like some other goods. There's a bunch of stuff that they were doing in terms of like calculating optimal strategies for certain types of games, like national security games. So there's the kind of like more like game theory side of things, where basically it's not so much mechanism design, but actually game theory and like making computations of optimal strategies. There's a surprising amount of stuff on congestion games where people want to kind of, where you kind of get lower utility for other people on the same square as you are, and so everyone kind of tries to spread out. And there was also a bunch of work in like auctions of various sorts, which somehow I think is kind of matching, but somehow it gets its own separate work. Now I think it's a little less fresh in my mind, but it was interesting. They had a whole bunch of different clusters of work, and but none of them were really like that directly relevant to our stuff. Like I learned about a bunch of impossibility results, like for example, they're like to do with like matching, to do with like impossibility of having optimal outcomes in imperfect information situations where the players have imperfect information. But they don't really seem to be doing much that's like super directly relevant to us. But also whenever I talk to anyone about like our blockchain problems, they find them, particularly interesting. I found one team there who was working on the validator's dilemma. Which they thought was super interesting. And I found it a little bit surprising that they were working on that problem, because like that it's I think a particularly difficult problem out of all the mechanism design problems that we have. And then it kind of
the thing, well, it is a problem that got published in a paper, and that makes it academically high status.
I see. yeah. And so it's interesting. I mean, I kind of gave them some tips about what a full solution would look like. I wouldn't be surprised if in the end it's impossible. Basically, the idea is that like, for any coalition of validators participating in a validator in a game where they want to reduce the amount of validation that they're doing, there is no strategy which is incentive compatible. Where basically like so there should be a protocol that incentivizes people to deviate and kind of rather than and will lead some of the nodes to end up signing invalid blocks and therefore be penalized.
What is the kind of top of the line in terms of like validator's dilemma countering research, by the way?
So here's like the best I know how to do is to give using like a private entropy type solution, give people the right to produce invalid blocks, in order to try to fool others in order to sign them, and give them a big reward if they do sign them and not otherwise. And like start and seriously penalize the people who didn't have a right to do it. And so basically, like with private entropy, you kind of say, look, you can like prove now or later that you had the right to produce this invalid block, and other people who aren't checking the validity will maybe produce a signature that says it's valid.
Right.
So
the idea basically is that you would like allow people to produce invalid stuff at some constant low rate without taking a penalty.
That's right. And basically, actually, they get a reward if they get other people to sign it. And so somehow, if they are part of a cartel, of a validator dilemma cartel, they get this like big incentive to deviate. And if they can get their whole cartel to sign it, then they get a huge payout.
Right. Well, what would they get? Basically, like the sum of everyone else's deposits.
I was thinking, multiplied by like 1/4 or something. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like to me, signing an invalid block is a uniquely attributable fault, and like to me, if something is uniquely attributable, like might as well give the full penalty.
Yeah. So I think definitely the full penalty needs to go to the people who sign the invalid block. The question of how much reward should go to the person who.
Oh, I see. Yes, you're right. You can't make the reward be 100% because then like that would potentially like cartels dodge penalties.
Yeah, and so that so 1/4,
Yeah, that's fine.
Still very substantial reward.
Yeah. Actually, it's in general. Actually, if you, I'm not sure if you've read my fully read my Discouragement paper, but one of the suggestions I have in there is that in the specific case where you have a uniquely attributable fault happens, like in pretty much all of those cases, you would give 1/4 of the reward to all of the non-faulty validators. Well, like in my case, it was half, but like it could be any fraction.
Okay, cool. No, I haven't read it in detail, right? Sorry.
No.
Yeah. So the issue with this kind of strategy that I gave, this protocol, basically is that like, as a cartel participating in the validation game, I might know the kind of baseline rate of invalid blocks, and say there's like very high probability that there won't ever be more than 4 of them at once. Then I like will choose 5 of them to do the full validation. and somehow if one of them is still isn't making an invalid block, then 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 like the cartel gets away with it. So but the flip side of that is that actually, like you say if I choose 5 people to do the validation, and like one of those 5 say like the last one of those 5 sees the other 4 and maybe they'll participate in the in like kind of a sub game of the validator's dilemma and decide not to validate. And so maybe there's a case to be made that like actually even a tiny amount of nodes having like a license to make invalid blocks just to catch people who aren't validating will prevent this simple strategy from working. So in that case, I think there's a pretty neat chance. This is a pretty good opportunity. So that's pretty neat. So that's, I think, the kind of like the state of the art in solving the validator's dilemma. Do you know of anything better?
No, I mean, as far as like in general, the idea of allowing people like somehow to create invalid blocks at some specific roll rate is like the best that I've best in class as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I agree. So that's interesting and cool. But yeah, so I'm hoping to get more and more of these people from this community to come join us on our problems, and I had so much fun at the conference that I'm probably going to go every year to their to the economic computation conferences.
Cool. Can you get me an invite?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I never got invited. I just kind of paid my way in. But
oh, I see.
If I do get invites, I will. I mean,
no.
I'll definitely at least like give advance notice and let you know, like, because this time I found out about it like 2 weeks ahead of time or whatever, and so I kind of made a last minute decision to go. But next time I'll keep an eye out for it. And in terms of research progress this week, that was the MIT ACM on, and then I went to New York on the weekend and gave a talk with Carl about Casper. And then this week I was in Brussels for the first half of the week. I was and which is why I ended up missing our meeting. I think I was like flying during our stand up. I was in Brussels, basically speaking with this policy lab about like kind of blockchains and different kind of like opportunities and risks that they pose to basically to Europe. It was kind of interesting, not really relevant to us. But then and then I went to this blockchain incredible party conference. It's one of my favorite conferences because of it's low on proceedings and high on like social events between speakers. And I gave a talk on crypto economics. And then when I was, I emailed this talk to like Vitalik and Georgios a few days ago, and when we were participating in this email thread, I kind of realized that I had previously made a little mistake in my analysis. So basically, I had kind of asserted that maximize. So there's that maximizing the robustness of a protocol is maximizing its resistance to extra protocol incentives. And I kind of thought that this was maximizing the security. Now I realize that it's a little bit more subtle than that. Basically, so the robustness of a protocol of an incentive mechanism I define as the minimum sum of perturbations to players' incentives required to get rid of an equilibrium or to like cause a particular failure. And I thought that corresponded to like the amount that the bribing adversary had to spend, or sorry, that maximizing robustness would be maximizing the amount that the adversary would have to spend, and then I realized that actually it's only maximizing their budget as opposed to the amount. And so that led me into this little investigation into the relationship between the robustness of an incentive mechanism and kind of security and the bribing adversary. And here's kind of what I found. So firstly, let me just be super clear. Like the main difference between the bribing adversary and the robustness calculation is that robustness also looks at negative perturbations as well as positive perturbations. And so not only do we care about like, you know, adding to the payouts, but also subtracting from them. And what I was able to show, that in independent choice, the minimum budget required for the adversary is precisely the robustness, both for getting rid of an equilibrium and for creating a new equilibrium. And the proof is relatively simple. I mean, for getting rid of an equilibrium, you have to create an incentive to deviate, and which basically means that you need to bridge the gap between you know, the current payout and like a payout associated with a different strategy. And namely, you want to pay the minimum amount, you find the one that has the highest payout associated with a different strategy, and then you can either say perturb the current payout to drop it below that amount, or add to the other payout to make it above, to bring it above, and those are kind of like the same amounts. But to create an incentive, to create an equilibrium, it's actually a little more complicated. You don't just have to create an incentive to deviate, you have to do kind of something quite a lot different, which is get rid of all incentives to deviate. And so if I choose a particular strategy profile and I get rid of all incentives to deviate, what that means is that I have to, like, for any player, look at the different payouts they get for different strategies, and to make sure that, like, say if I want them to, in the new strategy profile, I want them to play strategy I, then I need to make sure that all their payouts from other choices, from the deviations, you know, from from their individual deviations from that profile, their payouts are less than that. And actually, what I found was that the most effective strategy is to increase the payouts associated with that new equilibrium, because for every like 1 unit of like money spent there, or for every 1 unit of, like, you know, robustness, you know, or like of perturbations added there, it counts for 1 unit subtracted everywhere else in terms of the differences. And so you kind of get a big leverage from adding payouts for adding perturbations to the payout associated with their strategy that you want for the new equilibrium. And then only once there's only one left do we become indifferent between subtraction and adding. And so for individual choice, I was able to show relatively quickly that that robustness is precisely the minimum budget required for a bribing adversary. And so somehow maximizing the robustness of a protocol means maximizing the budget required for a bribing adversary to get rid of or to create an equilibrium. And that was really cool. I felt really good about that because it kind of, you know, bought me back a lot of the stuff that I was afraid of losing due to my kind of like clumsiness. And I suspect, but I haven't yet been able to prove that this is also going to be the case for the coalitional deviations. So for coalitional deviations, I was able to show that I can get rid of an equilibrium. So that if that the same result, where if I'm trying to get rid of an equilibrium, the kind of the robustness of getting rid of an equilibrium is the minimum budget required for an adversary to get rid of that equilibrium. Basically by a very similar argument, but basically I considered like coalitional deviations, and I was able to basically show that you know, I just need to create an incentive to deviate, and creating an incentive to deviate requires basically just like having more payouts coalition wise for that new profile rather than the old one, and kind of, you know, taking the strategy of the players outside the coalition to be fixed. It turns out to be like pretty much exactly the same argument, because I can kind of give coalitional strategies, which are which is kind of a collection of the player strategies. So I was able to show it for getting rid of equilibrium, but for creating an equilibrium, it ended up being a bit more tricky. And I haven't like finished the proof, or even really, I'm not really 100% sure that we're going to get this result, that the robustness of coalitional kind of equilibrium is, or like strong Nash equilibrium is what I'm targeting right now, is going to be equal to the minimum budget required for a bribing adversary. And the reason why it's tricky is because I don't have this kind of independence of the payouts associated with deviations for one coalition from another in the way that I have for players. So, for example, if I change the payouts for one coalition, it might for a particular, to incentivize a particular, to get rid of incentives for a particular deviation, it will affect the payouts associated with another coalition that is overlapping, right? And so this kind of overlap between possible coalitions complicates the analysis and basically has meant that I don't have a proof just yet. It makes the proof a little harder, and so I wasn't able to just like pump it out really fast. But I'm still optimistic. I still have this conjecture that indeed the robustness of a protocol is going to be precisely the minimum budget required for an adversary to get rid of or to create an equilibrium. And so I think that I think it's kind of super interesting. And then the other, and then basically this kind of calls for kind of another definition, which is basically to say that, so because just like how we have budget and cost as a function of the adversary, I kind of want a simpler one for something that doesn't have the adversary. Because the nice thing about the definition of robustness is that it is something that is somehow independent of the adversary model in some way, right? It's just kind of a property of the game itself. So the corresponding notion right now, I just want to call security, but I'm not sure if that's right. But also, but basically, it corresponds to the attack, the budget spent by an attacker, and it's basically not the total sum of perturbations required to cause this change, but just the sum of the perturbations in the strategy profile, which is the new equilibrium. And so that kind of corresponds to the cost of attack. Anyways, so that's kind of my main little like research contribution this week. I haven't had that much time to do research, basically because of my kind of traveling and conferencing. But somehow there was this interesting relationship between the broadening adversary and the robustness of a protocol, and kind of which can and you can kind of understand a robustness as in relation to the bribing adversary as being able to look at both negative and positive perturbations to the incentives, and not just positive ones like the adversary is able to do. So I hope that's somewhat clear. Let me know if you have any questions.
No.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I get the gist of your argument.
Oh, hey, Greg.
Hey, sorry I'm late. I'm at the Scribe offices, and we had a session that ran over.
Oh, cool. You're in Berlin now?
Yeah.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. We're kind of talking about getting a Golang node up on top of Big Chain DB. Oh,
interesting. Yeah.
That's really exciting.
Big Chain DB doesn't have any write contention. So I don't know how that's going to work.
Well, we'll have to see what they're about to redo their architecture.
Oh, so, okay. Well, I guess anything could happen in that case.
Yeah, it's not necessarily their old stuff. It's potentially Big Chain DB 2.0. So we're talking about what's possible, and can I drive requirements?
Neat. Anyways, hey Vitalik, you want to give your update?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I spent the last couple of weeks working on probably a few different things. One of them is continuing to try to push forward on this kind of basic sharding proposal. So this was this idea that you can kind of get sharding started off in a separate universe before kind of putting in all the pieces and then linking it into mainline Ethereum and kind of bringing in all the machinery to make everything kind of fully secure. And part of that was the shard architecture. Another part is I'm thinking, like in the process of thinking about changing the Ethereum architecture around a bit to basically kind of make it more friendly to various scalability techniques, state root only clients and parallelization and so forth. So like the idea would be that you could make the shards live under slightly different rules. actually very substantially different and totally backwards and incompatibly different rules from the existing shard, because like the shards are in some spaces kind of totally new land, and there's no backwards compatibility to worry about. So we might as well make it optimal, and then that way we can make the kind of sharded world much more scalable, and then leave the kind of current the current non-sharded shard pretty much the way it is. So I've been thinking for a few days about kind of how to make the design optimal, and it's currently from one of the more interesting research problems I'm thinking about is basically the problem of how to make the basically how do we make the system friendly to contracts that use lots of libraries. So one example would be for if you have a contract, and that contract just calls 5 other libraries, then you don't want to charge gas because you think that that's like five database reads, because that's really 5 database reads that are going to the same place as all the other stuff. And so like what I'm thinking is this idea that it might be possible to have some particular hunk of storage that everyone actually will download, and then basically store all of the frequently used code there. And like that might actually be one of the functions of the home shard now that of like the original shard. But like, this is still stuff that I'm thinking about. So that's one side.
Quick question. Can I ask a quick question about that?
Sure.
To make sure on the same page here, what you're talking about there is basically kind of sharding validation and storage, but not sharding consensus.
What do you mean? Correct.
So like we still kind of have the same fork choice rule. It's just that like instead of everyone having to process like everything, you kind of will validate and store fractions of it. But still like this there's going to be like a global set of validators and the 2/3 you're just implementing the finality gadget, and rather than like sharding that.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Great. Yeah. And so so like I really like the idea of having of doing anything that lets us think less about backwards compatibility, because backwards compatibility is one of the big pain points of reasoning about sharding Ethereum. Great. So yeah, sorry, go on.
Hold on. Yeah, so that's one side of it. So I just, in the Skype room, I also linked the basic sharding proposal. So that's the kind of the shard architecture. And the doc for this, like new more parallelizable account architecture doesn't quite exist yet, but I hope it'll exist soon because I'll be in the process of writing it. So that's the sharding side. Then on the proof of stake side, I have been basically doing this. I wrote 2 papers over the last couple of weeks, and I'll just link to both of them directly. And they cover basically extortion attacks and discouragement attacks. So an extortion attack is basically an attack where you have some coalition of validators, and we'll assume that the coalition has at least 50%. Basically, it says, everyone else, you have to give me money, or else I will censor you. And the idea is that in this kind of attack, the coalition has to pay money because, like, every time it censors someone, it loses money from that. And the coalition earns money because it earns extortion fees. And you can calculate what the maximum rational extortion fees are, and you can also calculate how much it loses from censorship. And basically, we're trying to figure out, like, under what conditions can you make sure that extortion attacks are unprofitable. And one of the important results that I've discovered, by the way, if people are following along the paper, this is on page 2 of extortion.pdf, is that there is a conflict between resistance to extortion attacks and greasing factors. And basically, if you're, the idea is that if you have a system where the it's resistant to extortion attacks, even if almost everyone pays up, then you have a system that has a high greasing factor. So if you make an assumption that like if 50% of validators are the attacker and portion H of validators does not pay up, then if in the case of that all the other validators except portion H pay the extortion fee, the attack can still be unprofitable, then that means that the mechanism has a griefing factor of 1 over 2H minus 1. So the closer to 0H gets, the higher 1 over 2H minus 1 gets. So then I talk about like this idea of like hugging the wall, where you can basically create a mechanism that has high griefing factors in the specific case of small attackers making small attacks, and lower griefing factors in the case of large attackers. And I come up with formulas for like NCP and NCCP. So the non-commit penalty and the non-commit collective penalty, where that accomplishes that. So basically, it's like never extortable. And the difference basically is that, well, the basic idea is that both the collective penalty and the non-commit penalty both depend on the number of other people that do not commit. So if portion alpha does not commit, then NCCP equals alpha and NCP equals alpha over 1 minus 2 alpha. So like basically you pay more for not committing the more other people don't commit. And like to me it's interesting that this seems to be optimal. But although I guess one concern is that basically like actually making NCP be based on the number of non-committers adds implementation complexity and might heavily reduce the efficiency of the whole thing. So I've been kind of holding off on that for now. And like actually the interesting thing is that through all of my research so far, the formulas that I have so far, so like the stuff I came up with about a month ago, where we just said NCP equals NCCP equals NPP equals NPCP equals 1, with P being equal to 1/2. Like so far, that's actually gotten a pretty good score in pretty much every single one of my analyses. So that's like fairly good news, right? So that's the extortion paper, and then I have a bunch of nice graphs about that. Then the second paper I have is on. By the way, any questions on extortion before I talk about discouragement?
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of questions. One of them is in terms of pre-committing not to pay extortion, and I remember.
So I'm still not convinced that pre-committing not to pay extortion is possible, because like the set of contracts that are extortion contracts is like halting hard to determine what it is.
Right, fair. But even like an extra band commitment. So there's I guess there's like there's a commitment, and then there's like a provable, like kind of a creditable commitment, and like kind of and kind of really game theoretic sense.
So right now I basically.
So like what as like a kind of thought, like what I would do is like if I was like if I got to like decide the culture, as I would like in the culture to like pre-commit not to pay extortion, and and somehow even behaviorally, I think that a lot of people would kind of balk at the thought of paying extortion and maybe would rather bear a higher cost, even though that's not the right
So currently the only tool I have for modeling that is the honest minority assumption that basically says portion H of validators refuse to pay these extortion fees. And under that assumption, basically like it requires H equals 1/3 in order to for extortion not to be profitable. But I guess one thing I suppose what I could do is I could also kind of redo the math where I add in like some specific distribution for a moral premium, but that seems just harder. And especially given that like the set of distributions for moral premium is like infinite.
And so by moral premium, you're being like, okay, I would pay extortion, but I'm not going to pay that much. I can only pay like less.
Well, no, it's like I wouldn't pay extortion unless paying extortion is the only way to prevent me from losing a really, really huge amount of money.
Right, which I think will translate into paying less extortion for a given attack. No?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Right.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that was kind of my question about that. Do you know any other defenses against extortion?
Let's see, right. So one is the moral premium. The other is making it designing the algorithm, make sure it's unprofitable. One other kind of assumption I'm making here is that it makes the assumption that the extorter is a 50% cartel. And the reason that I use to justify this assumption is basically that if the enforcer is less than 50%, then I kind of posit the willingness of everyone else to form an assurance contract to tell the extorter, screw you.
Right. Okay. Great. Yeah. Somehow so how does that work? I mean, the extorter like does have still have some ability to grief them with less than 50%.
Yeah, okay, so let's say the extorter, for example, has only like 25%. Then what would happen is that, let's say 55% would join into a contract that basically says, like, actually, so if, let's say the extorter has 25%, and then, well, it depends on how he starts his attack, right? So let's say he starts his attack by saying, I will grief you unless you at least like start probabilistically start griefing people that are not part of the set. Then what the others would do is basically they would enter into an assurance contract where they all put down a security deposit, or they might just socially commit, and they just like refuse to pay participate in the attacker's strategy. And they could even commit to crazy stuff like basically griefing everybody that the attacker doesn't grief by an equal amount to like completely neutralize the attacker's intended effect. So like basically the idea is that whatever the sensible counter strategy is, this kind of good guy cartel goes and implements it.
But that's also costly for the good guy cartel.
Yes, but it's less costly than the amount that the good guy cartel would have to pay had they been allowed themselves to become victims of the attacker.
Oh, and why is that?
Basically, I mean, in theory, because like the math works out that way. Although, like, I haven't done the math, but I'm fairly confident that it would work out that way.
Can't the extortioner just like ask for less?
So the extortioner could ask for less, but then the problem is that if they don't ask for the full amount, or if they don't ask for the maximum, then extortion becomes really hard because like whoever doesn't pay the extortion fee, they would still have to get censored, and that's the cost that the extortioner would have to pay. So the extortioner still pays the full cost of that, but only gets part of the benefit of the maximum.
So basically, we're assuming rational extortion only. And that's kind of where the constraint comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like
Great. Yeah.
Yep.
So, but like brinksmanship extortion may still be an issue where like
that's correct.
What do you mean by brinksmanship extortion?
I mean, I'll like convince you that I'm willing to do something irrational.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I see. So like, hold on. So what's the size of a cartel that would be doing this convincing?
Well, I mean, so it conceivably would be possible with a minority cartel also, right? Where you basically like, look, I'm willing to go off.
No, so you're basically saying like, unless you pay me, I'll go offline, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this actually falls back into the kind of general blackmailing case, because in that case, what you would do is the counter cartel would then say, oh, well, if your commitment is credible, then we will say, oh, well, you now have to pay us an extortion fee, or we will refuse to pay you the extortion fee and therefore cause you to go offline and cause you to lose even more money than we do.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just trying to remember like what the difference between extortion and blackmail now. Let's see. So
I think in general, like extortion is right. I see.
Uh,
I just time check. I've also got an update to give, and Vitalik also has the discouragement to discuss.
yeah, that's right. We started a little late, so I was thinking we'd go for another 15. But do you have also a cutoff, Greg?
Okay.
I mean, I can definitely go for another 15 or 20.
Okay, great. So V, do you want to talk about discouragement?
Sure. So the idea behind the discouragement attack is basically that an attacker acts maliciously in some way that causes him to lose money and to cause other people to lose money, with the goal of discouraging other validators from participating in the consensus. So like encouraging them to drop out and discouraging other people from joining. So this might have two purposes. One of those purposes is that if you have a protocol where the rewards to the validators are even at all inversely correlated with the total number of participants, and then this would increase the kind of base reward given to each validator, and so this might actually end up being for the attacker might end up being on net profitable. And so one example of how this could be the case is if, for example, rewards are transaction fee only, then
or if you have, or if you're, or in the whole like pay them like the square root kind of rule where you pay them more.
Exactly. Yeah, right. So I'll get into that. I'll get into p-values later. So I'll just kind of set up the problem first, right? So the first possible reason is for the attacker to make more money. The second reason why you might want to do a discouragement attack is because it's like a two-step 51% attack, where the first step is you kind of economically discourage most validators from being part of consensus. And the second step is you just then, kind of drop the bomb and do either like censorship or finality reversion or whatever. And now you have to pay much less because most of the validators dropped out.
Exactly. And that's the one that I'm mostly worried about.
Right. So so the way I set it up is I have this kind of general model of a consensus game here where you have like the attacker and the victims. And the attacker, there's a reward of in the protocol of 1 minus h divided by total deposit size to the power of p. So the idea in the numerator is that we can talk about h as being kind of the extent to which the attacker deviates from an honest strategy. And so the payoff to each honest validator is like 1 minus, so the thing at the top, 1 minus h, basically like if h equals 0, then it will be 1, which is kind of the base, and then h can, go up to make the push the reward down, and potentially if h is greater than 1, the reward goes negative. And then in the numerator, the denominator, you have a d to the power of p, which is the total deposit size to the power of some protocol parameter, right? So then to give a kind of intuition as to what the p-values mean. So if, for example, p equals 0, then the thing in the denominator would be a constant, which basically kind of means that validators earn some constant interest rate. If p equals 1, then that means that the total reward is independent of the validator size, and it's something that gets split between the validators. So like if you have a system where literally rewards are transaction fees only and that's it, then p equals 1. Then p equals 1/2 is like the way currently
assuming that all the transaction fees get distributed.
Yes, correct. So then p equals 1/2 is like the way current Casper works, and then p equals infinity is this weird special case where the protocol basically tries really, really hard to ensure that the total deposit size is some specific value. And then if the deposit size goes lower, then the interest rates keep going up, and if the total deposit size goes higher, the interest rate keeps going down. So it's kind of like difficulty adjustment. So then what I do is I basically the first half of my paper talks about discouragement for profit, and here I basically kind of model the game in terms of supply and demand curves. So if you go to page 4, you can see some examples where the supply curve is basically the interest rate that the protocol pays, like in the base case, depending on the number of validators. And then the demand curve is at each interest rate, how many validators are willing to show up. And then the supply demand intersection is kind of the natural amount of validators. And then if the attacker griefs, then the attacker basically depresses the supply curve, and that shifts the equilibrium down and left. So my argument is then if in the specific case where, so I have this where basically in the griefing, as a percentage, the attacker loses more than the victims, then discouragement attacks are never profitable because you know that the new equilibrium is down and left of the old equilibrium, and then the attacker might have to pay even more. But in the specific case where the attacker can force other people to lose a lot of money but not lose much money themselves, then you could potentially see cases where the attacker might be able to earn money through this attack. But then I basically go through and try and figure out under what conditions that would actually be profitable, and then I go start looking through and one of the important discoveries that I make is basically that having your p-value be lower actually is really important in resisting this kind of attack. So the fact that in current Casper p equals 1/2 and not p equals 1 actually is a fairly substantial boon in terms of the algorithm's ability to resist this attack. Then I and I have a bunch of math there. Then the second section, I talk about discouragement attacks for breaking consensus. And I basically point out that if an attacker can credibly commit to griefing with h greater than 1 in the next round, then all validators have the incentive to leave immediately, and then the attacker can attack with cost 0. And so I point out this argument that basically says, under this particular kind of economic model, this kind of attack is clearly 0 cost, and so it can't be easy under or discouragement can't be costly under all economic models. And then what I do is I try to relax the economic model a bit and make the economic model friendlier. So I have this sort of 3-phase game where in phase 1 the attacker griefs, in phase 2, and then in phase validators interpret that and decide whether to stay or join, and then in phase 2 the attacker makes a choice about whether or not to attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about finality reversion attacks. I bring up the specific case where you do this thing where if finality gets reverted, then half the penalties go to all the innocent validators. And I basically come up with a formula that says what the H value needs to be in order to bring the phase 2 number of validators to 0. And it's actually not that high. It's 1 plus probability of attack over 8 times the base interest rate squared. It's in there on page 8. So it's I would say our algorithm is actually probably remarkably brittle to that sort of attack. So it's
sorry, you broke up. Sorry, what was that? You'd say
our algorithms are fairly brittle to this kind of attack as far as we can tell here. Mm-hmm. The only sort of saving grace being that if this attack starts, then people obviously have a pretty far warning before the attack happens.
Mm-hmm.
So then I talk about one kind of the best counter strategy that I came up with. And the best counter strategy that I came there's 2 counter strategies. One of them is to restrict the H values that you can grief with. So basically prevent H from kind of going above 1 too easily, especially in the case where there's not many validators. And the second is this idea of bribing to counter grief. So the idea here basically is that the coalition of victims of this 2-stage attack get together and they make an assurance contract to bribe more validators to join. Mm. And then I basically evaluate the cost of that, and I try and determine what is the largest size of a coalition that of new validators that a set of victims can profitably bring in. And I get some fairly interesting results there.
Cool.
Yeah, and
so what's your kind of higher level thoughts on what does this mean for parameterizing Casper, and also for comparing our protocol against other protocols?
So I would say like, first of all, this idea that victims can kind of get together to form assurance contracts to deter attackers is something that's like fairly reasonable and important to lean on. The second thing is that in general, having low p values seems to just be a good thing in a number of different situations. And third, I would say that it's like, I guess like there definitely are limits to the security against these kinds of attacks, and these kinds of attacks are going to be much cheaper than just direct immediate finality reversions. But the kind of plus side basically is that like the network knows well in advance that the deposit size is going to go way down, and so the attacks are going to become cheaper, and so they can prepare for it.
Sure. And how about how about for like, you know, in like a proof of work context? So
in a proof of work context, extortion and discouragement are both like totally trivial, right? Because you can just like any 51. So all the attacks I talk about like are only really concerning basically in a situation where the attacker gets 51%. And
right.
in proof of work, like people basically assume that if anyone gets 51%, the systems might as well blow up, right? Whereas we have substantially stronger guarantees.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great. Yeah, that's I just wanted you to say that just for any listeners who, like, you know, maybe when they hear you say, "Oh, we're actually kind of brittle against these attacks," you know, maybe feel like this is like, you know, oh my God, we might as well just stick to proof of work.
Right. Yeah. No. Totally. Like all of these attacks. So like with proof of basically, like the thing to keep in mind, right, is that with proof of work, the greasing factor is infinity because a 51% attack, a coalition, or actually even with selfish mining, even a 24% coalition can do things that increase their profit and that decrease victims' revenue and cause victims to lose money, right? So, like that's something that proof of work definitely has. And so the way you would do a discouragement attack is basically that it's basically just like a simple spawn camping attack. So you just spawn camp a blockchain with 51% hash power, and then everyone else just gets deterred from participating.
All right. And is this you said an infinite greeting factor. Part of me wants to say, oh, look, it's a negative greeting factor because like I gain $1 to make you lose $1.
Right. I mean, you could call it negative. The only reason I call it infinity is just because it kind of fits better into the human intuition of like higher is bad.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's right. I think you know.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah. It's like negative greasing factor to me sounds like, oh, the only way to deviate from protocol rules is something that loses you money but gains the victim's money, which is unfortunately not true here.
Right. Yeah. I guess because like you know, in some sense, like -1 to 1 greasing factor is very different from a 1 to -1 factor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah. I'm happy with that. All right. So I guess are you done with your update?
Yeah, I am.
Cool. Hey, Greg, you mentioned that you have some updates.
Yeah, a couple of updates actually. I'll do a quick screen share. Hang on one second. Just bringing up a document. So we mentioned here, you know, I guess Vlad, you mentioned it, but also last week when you were flying, I mentioned some of the work that we were doing on applying your correct by construction version of Casper to replicating rewrite systems. So one of the things that I was stuck on a plane flying over on Monday evening, and I couldn't get on the Wi-Fi, so I just did some mathematics, and I was looking at seeing if we can optimize so that we don't have to consider general rewrite systems, but because I'm still worried. I'm still worried about the surface area of the rewrite system for the ideal adversary, and to make that calculation a little bit more tractable.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's totally fair. I mean, you know, for different rewrite systems, the amount of contention is much different. However, I'm not. The ideal adversary looks the same. I'm not sure but it may be less performant in some cases.
Right, exactly. That's right. So I came up with a classification scheme of rewrite systems that's actually kind of cool. And I actually devised a new kind of derivative that allows me to talk about these rewrite systems. So I have it on the screen. I can share I think I shared the slides also on the Casper scaling channel. So I'll just briefly touch on these. I won't go through them in detail since it's just an update. But basically, the construction is I'm going to define a derivative on some polynomial functors. So we have some k. So t is going to be parametric in two things. One is a single variable. So somebody's drawing on the screen.
Sorry, that was me. I didn't know what I was doing.
No worries. Anyway, so T is a parametric in two things. One is a collection of constant functors, and the other is a single variable. So you could think about this as like a Scala case class description. So either it's case object or it's case class K1, which has a single slot in it, which is of type X, or a case class K2, which has two slots in it, both of type X, et cetera, et cetera. So this all kind of is compactifies to a single nice notation. And now what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate a close up each of these X's you can think of as a hole or a parameter in your data type. And what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate one of these holes. And so I just show the process of the elimination of say, when we have a few of these. So like there's no hole in K0, so that just goes away. There's a single hole in K1, so that just goes to K1. And then K2, there are two ways we can eliminate a hole. We can eliminate a hole on the right, and we can eliminate a hole on the left. And what we eliminate it with is the reflective closure, right? So what's on the left-hand side is what's on the right-hand side. So the way you can think about this is think about it as what's in the second slot of this case class here is now a data type that freezes the computation in some sense. To learn more about the freezing of that data type, you can look at the row calculus as an example. And then notice that because you have an isomorphism between the product where this is on the left and on the right, we can rewrite this as 2 times this thing. And so in general, the derivative operates just exactly the way you expect the derivative to operate, right? So it's taking the xi to the xi minus 1, you get I of those. But now the one thing that's a little bit different is that you have, in the place where you've eliminated, you've got the reflective closure. So this turns out to be a formal derivative. And now the interesting thing is that you can treat these very briefly. Each case is a kind of potential for interaction. So K0 is no interaction. K1 is it's possible to interact. So the example from the row calculus to the pi calculus would be like output, right? So X is the Q, and sorry, this big X is the Q, and the little x is the K. And then here, this is binary interaction, but of course you can have multiple different ones. So you can think of the constants as like the place where things interact, and this is where those are the agents that are interacting. And now you can consider rewrite rules of this form. So there are these polynomial functors that go to some right-hand side. When I, which is a term inside this polynomial, is 1 or 0, those are known in the literature as heating rules. And when they're when I is greater than 2, they're clearly interaction rules. And so now we can just consider very briefly this idea that you rewrite a polynomial functor like this to its derivative. So what that's doing is you're just describing a freezing computation. So this is interaction which freezes a computation. A really good example is the row calculus. You can also unfreeze, and that's another thing that happens in the row calculus. And then the derivative, what's really cool about this analysis is the derivative is now formally connected to the dynamic evolution of the system. So, before, we had notions of behavior like in Newton's calculus, which is, got a derivative, and that's how you define behavior. But that's not really closely connected to the way we think about computational behavior, right? Computational behavior is much more easily interpreted in terms of rewrite systems. So connecting those two different ideas has always been kind of an interesting, mystery. How do those two different ways of thinking about the dynamics of a system relate? And this classification now relates them, because it turns out that kind of the summary down here. So the proposed framework is rich enough to model row calculus and hence pi calculus and lambda calculus. So we get coverage of a vast majority of computational models just with one kind of rewrite system here. And that's sort of the interesting import of the row combinator paper, is that we don't have to worry about binders. We can just worry about rewrite systems that have this kind of shape. And that's, I think that's super interesting, because now we can focus our on a more optimized ideal adversary calculation. So dramatically reduces the shape of that calculation.
So you mentioned that this is a way to like classify reduction systems.
Yeah, right.
And so how do you do that?
So the classification, essentially what it allows me to do is to consider only rewrite systems where interaction is in terms of evolutions of the class terms. So case class terms, and then I only consider the evolution of case class terms that freeze or unfreeze computation. But I can relax those I can now do I can how do I say this? I can look.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to head off right now, but
sure.
Thanks, just saying bye. So thanks for the call.
Bye, B.
Thanks.
Thanks for the updates.
So you can relax these different constraints. These are the constraints here are fairly tight, but you can relax them, and you can now get a kind of gradation of different rewrite systems depending on, like, for example, you only do heating rules, you only do interaction at certain arities of the variable, and so on and so forth.
So Greg, can you illustrate how your reflective closure thing differs in the case of, say, a binary tree from the normal derivative?
Yeah, because the binary tree gives adds holes. So the normal derivative, I assume by normal derivative, we're talking here about the Connor-McBride derivative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you add holes. Here we get rid of holes. Right. So that's kind of that's the idea. So that's why this term is always kicking around over here.
So X is a hole.
Yeah. You think of X as the hole, right? And now we're closing up the hole with the formal derivative. With the reflective closure, right? So we've now, the difference is right here. This occurs on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. That's not what happens in McBride's derivative at all.
Does this kind of let you talk about something like, so it sounds like, okay, you can say, okay, I can talk about systems where the reduction rules affect no more than like X terms in some, or X like subterms. I'm not sure what to call them.
Yeah, so you can think about it like that, right? It's like, where does the where's the point of action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here, by just considering rewrite systems where what I was interested in doing was completely minimizing the kind of rewrite rules I want to look at, and intriguingly, I can get coverage of row calculus, lambda calculus, pi calculus in terms of rewrite systems that are entirely expressed as rules of these two different forms right here. Right. So I can. So when you have interaction, the interaction collapses or freezes one piece of the computation, or when you have interaction, the interaction thaws some piece of the computation. So you can think about it as like packaging it up and storing it, or unpackaging it and starting to run it, and that kind of shape of computation is sufficient to give you a huge amount of coverage in terms of existing computational models.
Okay. I mean,
go ahead.
Seems interesting. Can you tell me about some degenerate cases? Like, say, imagine I have a system that always rewrites everything.
Always rewrites everything.
Rewrites everything to what?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so I mean, so basically, like, I don't know, like, let's think about like the game of life, where like everything is rewritten, like the whole state. I mean, there's like some sense of locality, but like everything is kind of rewritten according to like this one rule, like and then normally it's thought of like to be applied globally in a synchronized way.
Right. So this is not designed for graph rewrites. This is for term rewrites. So in order to talk about the comparison of this to the game of life, we'd have to come up with a term language for the game of life, and that might be interesting. It's probably easier to describe it as a graph rewrite system. So this is I'm only focused on term rewriting, and in particular, I'm looking at terms of a particular shape. Right. So these are terms that are built as essentially case class kinds of constructions or POJO kinds of constructions, and
sorry, POJO,
plain old Java object.
Sorry, yes. What? Sorry, there were two of you speaking, and I didn't catch that.
Plain old Java object.
Plain old Java object. Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. So
the reason why I ask is basically because of I'm kind of familiar with the interface that I need for my kind of correct by construction rewrite replication.
Mm-hmm.
And basically I need to be able to I need basically a memoized rewrite so that I can tell if two rewrites are in contention. And I need to be able to kind of see from looking at the rewrites, like, well, I need to be able to like construct the term at the end. So somehow it would be great if I can just like look at, rather than having to do the reductions, I can kind of like memorize them and look at only kind of like the outputs of all of the.
Yeah, that's exactly the point here. So what we're arguing. So what I was arguing was, you can immediately dispatch on the shape here to see whether or not there's contention, right? So they're either contending here, or they're contending here, or they're contending out through KN. So you can immediately, like with in constant time, you can detect contention. That is exactly the point, or one of the points of this analysis.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Greg, in our meeting in half an hour, I'd like to talk to you about this reflection a bit, because even the normal derivative reduces the power of x by 1, right? It introduces a whole, but that is getting rid of one x, as this one does. So I'd like to pick your brain.
Yeah, I understand exactly. Yeah. But the other thing,
the other comment I was going to make is that with the game of life, because the game of life runs on a real computer, there will be a term language that describes any finite population of life cells. And basically you'll have at the end of the term something that says, and the rest is empty.
Right. So
And so you can have rewrites that expand the current space into which the pattern has extended. This won't work in something like Rule 110, where you have to fill up infinite space with population, unless that population is defined by a specific pattern.
Yeah. Right. So the way I was thinking about it is that the term language there has to be like the entire grid. You don't get to describe like two different grids and then combine them, right? So there's no game of life is not compositional in that sense, or if there is a compositional form, I'm not familiar with it. So you don't get to describe the game of life doesn't describe how there's a subgrid of a grid that rewrites. You have to, as Conway defined it, he was really thinking about a kind of generalized Go, right? So you need like the whole game board, not a piece of the game board, in order to, right. So that's why it's not quite the same as a term language, because a term language, like, the P par Q, well, P would be one game board and Q would be the other game board, but there's no such construction there. Yeah.
Although you could imagine some kind of like asynchronous game of life where like things can be written rather than everything kind of in one, in like synchronized iterations. But like
it becomes possible. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we can consider lots of variations. But yeah. So I also wanted to quickly mention. I've been thinking a lot about a couple of different tests for the different consensus proposals. And what I'm thinking about right now is, imagine we have we wanted to write a game playing AI. So let's say we wanted to write a game playing AI that played chess. But this is a different game playing AI in the sense that we have an AI algorithm that behaves like a pawn, right? And we have an AI algorithm that behaves like a knight and so on. And each of them are vying to make either pawn-like moves or knight-like moves or queen-like moves, etc. And now they all have to consensus, and only one of those moves gets to go per round. And then we give some appropriate notion of round. Now, this is also so the thought would be, can I use a version of Casper to build, to build a single AI that out of this aggregate of AIs. So think about it this way: I've got I use the scoring system of the of chess for the pieces as guidance about weights, and now a pawn becomes a community that's a validator and proposers for transactions, where each transaction is a move for that pawn. Right, and the validator has roughly the weight of pawn, and so on for each of the different pieces. And now we can also talk about piece removal, as we can interpret it either as the cashing out of a validator or potentially network failure. And the thought is that if our version of Casper is good enough, I ought to be able to have a human being play against this community of little tiny AIs that are now assembled into a larger AI, which only gets to make one move at a time. So the block size is one, right? To give it that one move at a time kind of construction.
Yeah.
Right. And
I'm super confused.
What are you confused about?
A number of things. I mean, So I could see a system where we have, consensus on the state of a game of chess, and where the moves are, in blocks, and those blocks need to be proposed by validators, and where people give transactions to the validators. But the idea that the validators themselves are pieces, I think it makes it extremely confusing, because the validators really are coming to consensus on the state of the game, maybe. So the validators have to come to consensus. They don't. Their job isn't really. I mean, you can add a job to them to say only propose these types of proposals.
No,
But,
no. That's not what I'm saying.
The main purpose of the validator really is to come to consensus.
Yeah, understood. So here's what I'm suggesting. Each validator. So think about it like there's a validator for each that is in association with each piece, but they're not playing as a piece. Rather, there's a client set that hits for the move. There's a bunch of clients that are all trying to move one pawn, and they hit that one validator that has the weight associated with
but its weight could be arbitrary, and it doesn't affect at all this game of clients trying to play a game through the.
No, I understand. However, it becomes more interesting to mimic as closely as possible the structure of the game. So this is
so what I'm saying is basically like, no matter what weights you give, you still have clients. You still have a restriction that says, okay, this validator can only propose proposals for moving this piece. And it would end
but you don't have to do that, right? You just set up the validators. So the validators are all consenting on exactly one move. They have a block size of 1.
Well, I mean, they're all coming to consensus on the state of the game, which is updated one move at a time.
Right. Exactly. Right. So, but the flow of information is structured like the each individual piece. That's the important thing. So you've got a community that's trying to move one pawn. You've got another community that's trying to move another pawn, and another community that's trying to move the bishop. Another community that's trying to move the knight. Right, and they're all coming to consensus. Right, and
somehow like the higher weight pieces have an advantage with respect to them being more likely to get their moves happen first. And
that's correct. That's exactly
why. But that doesn't seem like chess at all, right? Like in chess, normally, like you might want to move a pawn first, even though you could move a queen also. You don't necessarily want the queen to always move before the pawn. In these race conditions.
Fair enough. I'm not saying that it has to play well. The important point is only that it has to play responsively, and number 2, that it has to that it has to come with a proof of consensus, right? So at every step we have to see that in fact what showed up, what was the cause of the move was the consensus. Right, and it's
kind of so you have a little bit backwards in the sense that like the move has to be proposed and then we have to come to consensus on it.
Oh yeah, no. But what I'm saying, no, not quite. What I'm saying is that when the community of of these little agencies finally by submitting through Casper. There is a move selected for that block, right? That particular move that was selected by Casper needs to, we have to have the proof of consensus. In other words,
no, you get that only after consensus. You don't get it before the move is selected.
I understand, but what I'm saying is, after consensus, I should have a witness, which is the proof that the consensus happened.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and once I have consensus, then I have a move. So
yeah, you have an executed move,
right?
As opposed to just a proposed move.
Correct, right? But so the point is that from the point of, let's say that white is the entity that is using consensus amongst these different agencies, then when white makes a move. Black can then query that move and say, all right, how do I know that you weren't just one person, making this move? And then white can produce a proof of the consensus. It can give a witness, right?
So now it sounds like you have two consensus protocols going on, not just
one. No, there's just one. It's just that white is a community that's acting as if it was a single agency, even though it's built up of multiple different agencies.
So then it sounds like white has a consensus protocol and black has a consensus protocol.
No, black is so imagine the setup. Black is playing as a human being.
Okay.
Right. So there's a human being. So
which is kind of like a trivial consensus protocol.
Right. Exactly. And white is now acting as a community of agencies that roll up into a single agency because of the consensus protocol. So when white proposes a move to black, black has an additional query that's available to it, which is to say, prove to me that you're not a human being acting, as a single entity. And so then white can pony up a certification. These are all of the proposed, moves. And here's the message flow that went through the consensus, and here's the block that was selected.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, so like that should be possible. I mean, basically, it's just a matter of like saying, look, here are the proposed. Here's how we came to consensus on this block.
That's exactly right. So to me, that seems to that. And if Casper is responsive enough to play a game of chess, now we're starting to get interesting.
Well, I mean, to me, I mean, it doesn't seem that much more interesting than like arbitrary computation.
Sort of, kind of, but it brings home because it brings home this idea that you can now roll up and coordinate a bunch of independent agencies into a larger, more capable agency, right? So
but all these agencies like quote unquote are actually like either validators or outside the protocol.
No, because we can write down the AI for a pawn, right? We can write down the AI for a knight, right? And everyone, you can see how the knight is attempting to move, right? The knight wants to do this.
But basically, like the consensus protocol has like a very, very clear interface, and like you're not like all of this stuff like that you're writing down is how it has to fit somewhere in this picture. Like it's either going to be like stuff that's being fed into blocks, or it's going to be part of the data structure that determines block validity, and then like that's it.
Yeah, understood. But you see, the point is that we're now using consensus to take a bunch of dumb, simple algorithms and potentially stitch them together into something that has more capability, more capacity. And we don't know, right? Because it may not play very well. But here's the analogy. In robotics, there was a major stumbling block when people were trying to put the motor control into a single centralized computational unit. When they pushed the motor control out to the limbs, like in the 80s and 90s, there was this big, huge jump in robotics where they would build these ant robots by pushing the intelligence out to the legs of the ant. There was like very, very little in the way of intelligence in the central unit. It was largely just passing messages back and forth amongst the legs, right? And most of those messages were about the local movements of the legs, right? So suddenly you get this emergence of new capability in the ant robot by distributing out the intelligence to the components that are interacting with the world.
So basically, like there's like kind of a couple of options, right? There's like there's like choosing between mutually exclusive alternatives, and then there is the question of like what estimates are justified, like, and the only kind of aggregating that really happens if you don't consider choice and aggregation, is in the canonical estimator.
No, but this is what I'm arguing, is that the choice itself is interesting.
Okay.
Here the choice of move becomes interesting. Now
it's going to
again,
be one move out of n that are proposed by the validators.
that's correct, and that's why the weighting also becomes interesting, right? The way by changing the way the stake is distributed, you'll get different playing capacities in this collective agency.
Yeah, although there's also a big way in which it's not just the weights, but also the particular message arrival orders that determine the outcomes. And so but actually, validator could totally lose priority because other validators communicate better.
I agree with that. But that's you can at least in terms of running these as tests, you can use that as a parameter, right? You can tweak that by a parameter. And then
this test is kind of just like hardcore,
Yeah. So then the other variation of this is to try a game like Go, where so it's the same idea. You only have the intelligence of a particular stone, but now the difference between the stones.
Anyways, I'm gonna have to go. I don't want to hear this whole thing again for Go.
all I wanted to point out is that now the validators come and go.
So the validator rotation is absolutely a tricky thing,
right?
And to do with safety. I mean, and Vitalik has a nice safety proof for how to do that. Which isn't actually a key. It isn't actually part of. It isn't. I haven't kind of factored into the correct by construction approach yet, but I hope to.
Again, the point of these is to try to use them, use the tests to see to begin to explore the limits of what's possible with these consensus algorithms. Sure. These are tests.
Got it.
Yeah. Cool.
Anyone else have anything? Anyways, I've got to run. It's been fun. Talk to you guys next week.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.